Firstly, this meeting is brought to you by Resilient Hurunui. We're a small group who were looking at positive responses to climate change, and we've been lucky enough to find a group of speakers that will support that objective. And so we've got a programme of talks lined up through this year. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Anita Wreford. Anita is an applied economist at Agribusiness Research Unit at Lincoln University. She specialises in responses to climate change for agriculture and the natural environment. Anita was lead author in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report. She's currently lead author on the Australasia chapter of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. She is also part of a team conducting New Zealand's first national climate change risk assessment. Anita's worked closely with local and central government in the UK and in New Zealand. So I'm now going to hand over to Anita. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start my timer so I don't go on for too long. So thank you very much for inviting me here this evening, and thank you for coming out on an evening to listen to me. So I think Viv heard me first when I spoke at a Geographical Society conference towards the end of last year when the special report from the IPCC had recently been released. And so there I was talking a lot about that report, and which is about climate change and land. And I'm going to also talk about that a bit tonight as well, because there are some high-level messages that I think are really important for us here in New Zealand and in the Hurunui as well. But then I'm also going to try and bring in the New Zealand context a little bit more about what's happening, I guess, at a national level, and then some of the research a little bit around what I'm involved in and about how we can adapt to the impacts of climate change. But I just also want to say first up that I am like an interdisciplinary scientist, mostly specialise in economics and social science. So if you've got any burning questions about the physical science of climate change, I'm not your person. So I work with those people and I sort of take on board what they produce, but I'm not I don't have a detailed knowledge of the processes that drive the models that produce these projections that we use and things like that. So just a disclaimer. I'm really happy to have questions at the end of the talk, and also if you're not clear about something during the talk, please just interrupt me. I'm completely happy to do that. So I'm going to talk tonight. Now I do hope that this changes. Sorry, it was set up nice. Oh, here we go. I'm in a slightly different thing. Okay, that's better, yeah. So I will talk about this, the special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out last year, the headline messages from that around climate change and land. And then, as I said, I'll talk about a little bit about what New Zealand's doing and then how we can adapt to the impacts of a changing climate. So I often start, and I've used this cartoon for quite a few years now, and I'm pleased to say that the future is kind of not turning out to be quite how this cartoon says. So it starts with in 1990, we've got a scientist in their lab coat saying, so we think climate change could be a problem. And then as we go through time, they're saying, yep, no, we've checked, it definitely is a problem. We should probably be doing something about it. And at the time this was written, which was in 2013, they've got 2019 as the final image, and they're like wondering if anyone's hearing the message. Is the microphone on? And I'm kind of encouraged to see that actually now the message seems to be starting to be heard. And although we maybe aren't making enough progress in terms of our actions, we are at least listening to the message and thinking that we need to be doing something about it. So maybe it's time to stop using this cartoon in my talks, but we'll see. So that special report that I'm going to talk about really its underlying message was really that land is so essential to everything that we do. So it's where we live. It generates the food that we eat, the water that we need, the places we live, our businesses and things, everything, the ecosystems out, the places that we love, we all depend on the land. And it's under human pressure, even without climate change. Land can be part of the solution to tackling climate change, but it can't do it all. So that's sort of one of the underpinning messages from that report. Now, the report itself had a very long title, which is written on the left there. I'm just going to go through and unpick, though, what it actually contains. So this was basically, I guess, some background. The IPCC is a body of international governments that commission scientists to write reports that basically they don't do new research, but they synthesize the existing research that we already have and kind of pull it together in a package so that policymakers and decision makers have access to the latest best science. And so they have a cycle of assessments, and they are currently doing their 6th assessment cycle, which will be reproduced in a couple of years. Come in. But they also do these special reports. So special reports are around particular topics, and these come together from proposals from governments who put forward topics that they would really like the IPCC to look into. And so for this one, they had quite a diverse group of suggested topics, but the common theme that they all had was land. And so that's why these different topics are lumped in together with so climate change, desertification, land degradation, sustainable land management, food security, and greenhouse gas fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems. So there's a lot going on in that report. And so one angle of it is the desertification, degradation and food security angle. And that's really thinking about how climate change is affecting our land and what we do with it. But then it has the other angle of the greenhouse gas emissions in our system. So that's how we use the land affects the climate. And that's a topic that we're grappling with in New Zealand. Bless you. And then the final kind of component is sustainable land management. So that's kind of, I guess, about how we bring the two, the impacts of climate change, our contribution to climate change, how we manage the land to deal with that and still continue to produce food and all those things that we value from the land. So that's why I guess it's kind of grouped together, but it did mean it was a very large and complex report, I guess. But some key messages for it, well, this is kind of what I've already said, is that it's a critical resource. We rely on it for all the things that we value, but it's already under growing human pressure. And even before climate change comes into the picture, we've already put a lot of stress through the way that we live, farm, manage our waste and resources. And climate change is adding to those pressures. So it's really making this challenging situation worse, and it's undermining food security. Now, food security isn't something that we necessarily have to think too much about in New Zealand. We are a pretty food secure country, but globally, and this report is of course global, that's a really important consideration. In fact, it's one of sustainable development goals is food security, and we're really failing in achieving many of these aims, and climate change is making it worse. And unfortunately, as we're hyper aware, I guess, in New Zealand, that agriculture, food production and deforestation are some of the big drivers of climate change, especially in terms of when we're thinking about the land. And this is, I'll come on to, I guess, New Zealand's response and also the challenges that addressing these activities have on our wider communities. So one of the things that this special report anyway produced was these graphs, and they're called burning embers, or they've come to be referred to as burning embers. And you can see why, because of the graduation in colour, which kind of resembles a flame or an ember a little bit. And they're really just designed to, there's a lot of background that goes into them, but they're really designed as a visual to summarise the effects of, on different systems of increases in temperature. So just to sort of run through it, we've got some key areas of concern when we're thinking about land and climate. So we've got water scarcity, soil erosion, vegetation loss, wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, tropical crop yield decline, and food supply instability. So those are just some we picked out to look at in more depth. And then up on the left, we've got temperature increases. And so this is the increase above the pre-industrial temperature. And you can see we've got 1, 1.5, 2, 3 degrees, blah. And you can see also there's a grey line that which is at 1 degree, and that's actually where we are at the moment in terms of increases in temperature above pre-industrial. And the point is that as we, the different colours illustrate when impacts become significant. And so yellow or white is kind of, it's okay, it's not really an issue. Yellow is low impact or minor. Orange becomes greater, red is then major, and purple is very high. Sorry, there was a key, it's fallen off the figure. And it just shows that for different systems, different temperature increases pose different types of challenges. And one key thing to highlight, I guess, is that on the food supply instability problem, it's already an issue, even at 1 degree. So this is where, you know, the food security that I just talked about comes into play. But it shows that even if we go half a degree more, it's going to become more problematic. If we look at something like soil erosion, even at higher increases of temperature, it's still an important issue, but you can maybe cope with some higher degrees before it becomes too problematic. So that's just a visual image to convey some of the messages. Now, it's also interesting to think about those differences in temperature, because it doesn't seem like a big difference, what, half a degree or 1 degree change. But there was another special report that you might have seen in the media in 2018, and it was this report about the global warming of 1.5 degrees. And that was really interesting for me anyway, because I get excited about these things, but it was really looking at what are the implications of a world at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial compared to 2 degrees, and that's only half a degree difference. But that report really found that actually that difference is critical. If we can keep warming below 2 degrees, ideally at 1.5, it's kind of within the bounds of impacts that we can manage. But when you start going to 2 degrees, it's outside anything we've experienced before, and it's really going to push our capacity to cope to the limit. And they said that we've got 12 years to really bring our emissions down to avoid the 2 degree increase. And that was in 2018, so now we've got 10 years. And unfortunately, we're not making too much progress on that, but we'll talk a little bit about that now. So you're probably familiar that we have this international agreement known as the Paris Agreement. And this was signed by a lot of countries. Some notable ones have withdrawn, unfortunately, but really most countries signed up to it at least. And the goal of that was to keep temperature increases well below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally to try and limit it to 1.5. So that's kind of in line with that special report, although the Paris Agreement was signed before that report came out. So maybe if they'd seen that report, they would have tried harder to keep it to 1.5 degrees. And within the Paris Agreement, every country comes up with its own commitments. So every country comes forward and says, like, this is what I think we can achieve as a country. And so New Zealand's commitment under that is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels, which is 11% below 1990 levels. So the previous agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, used 1990 as a baseline. And just to compare with other countries, so the EU has quite an ambitious target, more ambitious than ours. It's 40% below 1990 levels, but they're already well on their way towards that. But that's partly also because of some sort of structural and economic changes within some of their countries that's allowed them to do that. But they have been more proactive, probably. They've probably been the most proactive region in terms of trying to reduce their emissions. The US is still part of the Paris Agreement, although they've said they've withdrawn from some aspects of it, but they do say they will still meet their targets. Well, we'll see if that's going to happen or not. And they've sort of set a similar goal to New Zealand's, slightly lower. China's got a completely different goal. They've said that they'll peak their emissions before 2030. So, but actually, I've seen some analysis and showing their emissions in the previous years, and actually they are, you know, although they're still a huge emitter, they are actually making some changes that mean their emissions aren't increasing as much as they had been. So we'll see about that as well. So this is just a graph showing, or a map showing all the countries that have committed to the Paris Agreement. So there's really good buy-in to it, but as always, it's whether anyone does what they say they'll do. Now, we then have some research which has looked at what all those countries' contributions and commitments add up to in terms of actually keeping our temperature to those under 2 degrees or under 1.5 degrees. And there was a report that came out in 2018. I'm not sure if they did another one last year. It might come out soon. But really they found that the current commitments will not be enough to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. In fact, they will imply that the increase in temperature will be 3 degrees by 2100. And if we look back at that figure, you know, at 3 degrees, those are really darker colours indicating much more significant changes to these systems than at 2 degrees or 1.5. So it's pushing most of these systems into the extreme kind of risk at 3 degrees, and we'd like to avoid that. So that's with the commitments that countries have put forward. We're on a 3 degree trajectory. Unfortunately, most countries aren't even on a path to meet those commitments. So this is all actually a little depressing. So I don't want to depress you, but hopefully we'll come to some sort of sign of hope as we go through. But yeah, I mean, we're actually not seeing signs of peak emissions yet. 2018 emissions reached a record high. The figures haven't come out as far as I'm aware for 2019, but it's not kind of looking too promising. These are just different, I guess, the different major players' emissions over time. So the dark blue, sorry, it's probably very small for you to see. The dark blue is the US, the lighter blue is the EU, China is the red one, India's orange, and then the rest of the world. So you can see that we're still having significant increases, particularly in the rest of the world. The EU, the US are actually pretty stable. Yeah, it's just kind of interesting, I guess, to see where those emissions come from. But the point of the overall figure is that they're increasing. And that same report identified the kind of trajectory we'd need to be on to meet those targets. So the black line at the very top is if we didn't have the Paris Agreement and we didn't have anything in place, that's the kind of percentage increase, I think. I'm not, sorry, I should have got a key on the left, but we'd be going up if we had no policy. With the current policy, we're going up, but it's just at a lower level. If we didn't have the Paris agreements, that's the red and the orange, there's conditional and unconditional. So they bring it down a bit further. But if we really wanted to be serious about avoiding those worst impacts, we would need to be on this green line, which is emissions dropping like a stone from this year, in fact. And even if they were going to keep to the 2 degrees, we'd need to be dropping significantly from now. So that kind of puts it all in a bit of context. But luckily, some countries are going beyond their Paris agreements, and New Zealand is one of them. So we have more ambitious targets now in New Zealand than we've put forward under the Paris Agreement. So we've got the Climate Change Response Amendment Bill, the Zero Carbon Act, as people, well, it's an act now, sorry, I should have updated that. So which came into force last year, which was fantastic. I guess that we're setting some serious targets. How we go about achieving them will be another interesting thing to look at. But this act sets new emissions targets, so they're above our previous ones and above the Paris Agreement target. So first of all, we're setting all emissions except methane to net zero by 2050. And then methane, you're probably aware, being in a rural community, was treated differently, and this is because it acts differently in the atmosphere than the other gases. So the target for that is 10% below 2017 levels by 2030, and between 24 and 47% below 2017 levels by 2050. So this is a lower target than the other gases, but for those of you in the agricultural sector, you'll be aware that actually that's still pretty ambitious and challenging for our current systems. And then there's other things in there, sort of emissions budgets, and these are really important so that we have a pathway to achieving these goals, and we don't just wait to the end and then hope that we can reduce them in 2049. And that the government develops and implements policies both for climate, for reducing emissions as well as adapting to the impacts of climate change, which I'll talk about as we go through. And it's establishing a new climate change commission. So the commissioners were appointed at the end of last year, and this is, as you indicated, I did used to work in the UK, and the UK has a climate change commission, which is really, sits outside government, it's independent, but it's really well respected and performs a really important role. So I'm optimistic that having one in New Zealand will be a positive step towards meeting these goals, and also setting strategies and long-term visions for how we meet our climate change goals. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about agricultural emissions. It's sometimes when I talk to farmers and things like that, people get very angry about this. So I'm just telling the situation. I'm not responsible for setting the situation. And I come from a farming background myself, just so you know. But I think, so from the special report on climate change and land that I first talked about, it really emphasised that if we are serious about reducing emissions globally, we have to also think about our agricultural emissions at an international level. That's something I guess we've always known in New Zealand, because they are such an important part of our national emissions, but internationally they're not really seen, depending what country you're in, they're not seen as so important. But this report really emphasised that they have to be part of the picture. And so globally, around 23% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, deforestation, and the destruction of peatlands. So it's globally still pretty significant. It's not as high as it is, it's not as high a proportion as it is in New Zealand, but it is still significant. So you're probably aware that in New Zealand, agricultural emissions, or the way we report it anyway currently, make up 48% of our total emissions profile, so that's almost half. And for a developed country, that's really unusual. So it's because agriculture is such a big part of our economy, of course. So we don't have the industry which would, generate lots more emissions, and it's very significant to our economy, and it also produces almost half of our greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at other developed countries, they're usually under 10% of emissions. Ireland is the next country that has maybe the closest profile to ours. I think their agricultural emissions make up around 30-something%. But we're pretty unusual. And so in that sense, the rest of the world is looking to see how we tackle our emissions from agriculture. So how we, the policies that we set, and also how we monitor and evaluate and implement them, which is really difficult because, as I'll just show you a figure, well, we can look at it now. It's not like in a factory where you've got, you know, you're burning coal, you've got a certain amount of coal, and there's a really clear relationship between burning coal and the emissions that you generate for every tonne of coal that you burn. In biological systems, those relationships are much different. They depend on the soil type and the animal type and the temperature and what you feed them, and so it's so much more uncertain. So if we're trying to include them in like a trading scheme or something, that poses a lot of challenges. But this is a sort of very generic cycle of emissions that you might find in coming from the land and are being absorbed by the land. So of course we've got trees absorbing carbon dioxide. We've got some of our processes like fertiliser and the manure from animals that interacts with the soil and produces nitrous oxide. We've got methane coming from the animals directly, and we've got soil carbon, which is probably a really big store of carbon, but we actually don't know so much about it, and also we're not really clear yet about how we manage the soil, how much that releases from the soil either. So that's quite a big unknown actually. But yeah, there's a lot of complex interactions going on, and it poses challenges when you want to sort of do accounting for these things and reporting at the international level. Livestock emissions, yeah, so we kind of touched on that a bit. So I guess just to highlight that if we didn't do anything, our agricultural emissions are likely to continue to increase. That's our target for the Paris Agreement, that dotted line. If agriculture, for example, was exempt from reducing its emissions, it would mean that the other sectors of the economy would have to reduce so much more, because they would almost have to double their commitments if agriculture wasn't part of it. So you can see why we need to consider our agricultural emissions, but also why it's complicated. We've got really good research in New Zealand understanding the options for reducing emissions in agriculture. We're really world leaders in this space because it's so important to us. And broadly, we can think about things that we know already about our systems that we have, so we can increase efficiency and maybe implement new technologies that are already around. We're doing research into additional technologies that can reduce emissions directly, so things like methane inhibitors are apparently in the pipeline, although I don't know how long that will take. And then as a third step, I guess it's thinking about how we actually change the type of production that we do, and maybe shifting away from livestock in certain places. And that's, I guess, where it presents challenges to people who have built their livelihoods on this type of production. There was a report a couple of years ago which was produced by all the major sort of agricultural players, as well as the Ministry for the Environment. We've got Dairy NZ, Federated Farmers, Beef and Lamb. So they commissioned a lot of research to look at what is feasible in our current systems to reduce emissions. And they found that around a 10% reduction in our current systems is feasible, without shifting too radically to anything else. And that's, I think, that's partly what informed the target for the bill. But anything beyond that, they really stress that is going to need a combination of on-farm mitigation and land use change. So if we want to go beyond 10% reduction, which we've said that we do, we will be looking at land use change. So these are, I might just skip through this. It's from that global report. I guess it's just to identify that, or emphasise that every region's different, and we have that in New Zealand as well. We can't sort of generalise always for everywhere, because the local conditions are so different. But globally, of course, that's even more the case. one of the things that the report also emphasised is that we can do a lot without competing for land for food or biodiversity and things like that. So globally there is quite a concern, as we're seeing in New Zealand, I guess, that land will be taken out of production for food and used to grow trees, maybe for their sequestration, but also for fuel or other kind of fuel crops. And this report did identify that if we do things carefully and plan well, that we can do that without competing for that kind of land. But other options, so if we're really thinking aggressively about biofuels and things like that, we will actually need to use more land for that sort of mitigation activity. But I won't go through too much of this. That's just summarising, I guess, what I just said, that the land that we're already using, we could do what we need to do without cutting down native forests and things like that. But if we wanted to try and have a minimal impact, we really need early action on all fronts. So I guess just highlighting that the policies and governance are critical. And Andy Reisinger, some of you might have come across him or heard, he's a scientist in New Zealand, but he's really involved with the IPCC as well. And he summarised this massive document, which is several volumes, into a series of haiku, which is a Japanese poem form, which is based on simplicity and kind of cutting to the key messages, which was brilliant because sometimes you just need to cut through everything to get to the point. And really what he's saying is that we need policies in order to get to where we want to go. So things don't happen by themselves. So, okay, so I don't want to spend maybe too much time on this, but our current policy at the moment in New Zealand is the emissions trading scheme. So that's clearly hasn't worked very well until now. It's being reviewed and they are looking at how we can incorporate agricultural gases into that mechanism. But for the reasons that I mentioned before, it's really complex. We've had a number of different proposals, and as I say, I won't go into the detail, but some of them consider whether we price the units at the farm level, in which case we would have thousands of people trading in this scheme based on these uncertain emissions from their biological systems, or whether we price them at the processor level, which is then a very blunt instrument and probably wouldn't capture many of the actions that people are doing on farms. So there has been quite a bit of thought going into that and looking at how we can address those challenges with either of those options. And I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure they haven't agreed. They're still doing a lot of modelling around what this might mean and how we might implement it. But as I say, the rest of the world is really interested in what we do in this front. So we also need joined up actors. And I guess this is where I just wanted to touch on the fact that we've got some policies that sound initially really positive, maybe, such as the billion trees policy, but now we're starting to see how that might have unintended consequences for our communities and maybe our food and livelihoods and things like that, where we're seeing a little bit in some areas farms being sold to forestry, and what does that mean? And now we're also starting to have conversations around, well, in a changing climate, how will these monocultures of forestry, what will that mean if we have fires and pest and disease outbreaks and things like that as well? So we need to be really careful about how we make decisions. So the choice of our policies is really critical. And I'm just going to show one more of these figures from that IPCC report, which is the burning ember diagram again. You'll be really tired of these by the end of it. But this is looking at it in a slightly different way, because what it's looking at is also considering shared socioeconomic pathways. So the SSP1 and SSP3 are different scenarios of how the world might evolve between now and the end of the century. So SSP1 is a sustainability focused world. So we have actually low population growth, we have high equality between countries, we have good connected trade systems, and we put a high priority on how we manage the environment. SSP3 has a high population at the end of the century, and it has high inequality between countries and very little trade, so countries have become more protectionist and isolationist. And yeah, so they don't put a high priority on the environment. And so overlaying those scenarios on the biophysical kind of evidence of the previous ones, we see that actually for this, these are three key risks. If we look at food insecurity, for example, under SSP1, actually the risks remain low, even up to 3 degrees of temperature, compared to an SSP3, where at 1.5 degrees, we're already starting to see higher risks because of that, those other factors that are affecting our, I guess, the way our world operates. So basically the point that this is trying to make is that although to some extent the climate changes are, I won't say fixed, but given that we'd have a certain amount of climate change, the way we manage our economies and societies will really impact how those climate changes affect us. And I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about. And this is just another figure, and I do apologise if it's tricky to read, but the same kind of analysis is linking the different SSPs with differences in land use. And I'm not going to go into them too much, but I guess the main point is this one here is SSP1, and those two are, so SSP, sorry about the different terminology, but anyway, the SSP5 is very resource intensive, and the middle one's kind of middle of the road. In the first one, where we're sustainability focused, we start reducing emissions early on, and it means that actually we can keep more of our land in natural land, for example. So the red line is sort of in the middle, around 0. In these other scenarios, because we delay action, we then need to use more of that kind of land for things like bioenergy, which is the purple line. So for example, in SSP5, the bioenergy goes up really high and pretty dramatically as, I guess, the world realises they have no alternatives. We haven't reduced our emissions by changing our behaviour, reducing our fossil fuel consumption and things like that. We're going to have to plant loads of bioenergy, loads of trees, and we're going to have to cut down our native areas to do that. So it's kind of just, I guess, helping us think through the implications of some of the timing of our choices as well, and what they mean for other things that we value. I guess I'll just highlight that clearly there's been a lot of it's very unsettling time for farmers, and not only around climate change, also around regulations around water quality and animal welfare and things like that, as well as just trying to maintain their businesses. And then we've got climate change on top of this. And so we're seeing and hearing in the media and talking to people as well that they feel really that they're under siege. And they feel that the rules have changed, and sorry, when I say they, it may be you. And it's challenging, and I just put this little figure here up because it illustrates that the decision context, the way where we make decisions, is kind of in this interacting nexus of the rules, which are the regulations, the knowledge that we have, so that's maybe the scientific knowledge about climate change, and our values. So values are also things that we care about, but also our kind of behaviour and our communities and things like that. And that decision context is kind of at the heart of that. And unless we can, I guess, get that space where our values are more aligned with each other, that there's very little space in the decision-making space to actually make change. And I think unless we can bring everybody, or as many people as possible, on board, we're still going to have this tension between this kind of need to address climate change, but also maintain the things that we value as individuals and for our communities and our businesses and livelihoods. So I think that's an area that we need to really spend a bit more time thinking about, is so that we can actually achieve these bigger aims that we have. But one thing that is probably bringing things home to us more and more is seeing some of the impacts of climate change. So fire, well, that headline was from when we had the Port Hills fire, but fire's been a massive thing in Australia. Like, the whole continent seems almost as if it had been on fire, and the country seems really unable to cope with it. And that's a wealthy country. So it kind of makes you think, well, if Australia is in this position, what's it going to mean like for the rest of the world as we experience more and more impacts? How will we be able to adapt to them? So New Zealand's, I would say, come a little late to the conversation around preparing for the impacts of climate change. I was in the UK for 10 years, and I went there in 2006, and they were really already considering very carefully what they could do to prepare for climate impacts. But now that now that we're thinking about it, we're doing some important work. So there's been a few recent documents and processes that have really galvanised this area, I suppose. And one of these is the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which is our first national risk assessment. It's going to be repeated every 6 years, and it's really identifying the high-level risks for New Zealand, and then that will lead to an adaptation plan. So it's the first time we've kind of had this national level consideration of what are the main things that we need to think about and how are we going to address them. There was also, so we've got this document here is the projection, so that for New Zealand, so that's quite useful information about how the climate may change. I'll talk a little bit about how certain we are about that in a minute. We've had some recommendations for adaptation and a report on the implications for New Zealand. So I'm conscious that I'm actually talking much longer than I had hoped to. So one of the things is that we are, water is becoming, well, it's always, I guess, been an issue, but it's becoming a really central kind of issue, even without climate change, I suppose. But climate change is definitely exacerbating the issue of water. And we seem to be in a bit of a drought situation in New Zealand at the moment. And this is a map that NIWA produces. This is a link here. Some of you might be familiar with it, but they update it every day and just illustrate or identify the areas of New Zealand that are in drought on this day. And so this was on the 17th of February, but you can see that a significant part of the country is at least very dry, if not extremely dry or in drought or severe drought. And obviously we've heard a lot, well, feels like we're hearing quite a lot about Northland, but there are parts of the South Island and this area as well that's very dry, isn't it? From what I understand, and it's rated as extremely dry. And then actually I pulled out one indicator for the Hurunui district. I'm not sure if this is west or not. It seemed to come up as west. I didn't see an east, but and this is the drought indicator value. So you can also just go and put in your area, and it shows you where you are on their scale of drought, and this goes back to I think 2005, and so you can see where we are now. We're reaching it, I guess. Well, you'll be more aware than I am, but you know, we're on the track to reach one of the highest or the most severe droughts in this period. So I guess this raises questions. If you're a producer, if you're working on the land, you might be wondering, is this going to continue? Are we going to see more of these kind of situations where we have less water in this region or across New Zealand? And what does that mean for what I'm producing? Should I be thinking about switching to a different kind of production that uses less water? And this is an area that I'm quite interested in my research, is thinking about making decisions despite not really knowing exactly what the future will hold. So we've got, as I said, we've got these projections from this MFE Ministry for the Environment report, which is based on NIWA projections for future climate. And this is showing rainfall changes. Now, there's a lot going on here, but they're for regional council sites. And we've got the different colours are different scenarios of future climate change. And we really don't know which scenario we're going to be on yet. So we're kind of, often people will take one scenario and maybe the average or something, but that's actually could be dangerous because you could end up choosing a scenario that turns out to be actually quite wrong, and you might base your decisions now on that and turn out to be more vulnerable in the future. Some of the points to make from this are that you can see that even within one model, so if we one scenario, there's quite a range in length of the bar, and that's because there are different models that are used to run each scenario. So although this might give you some indication of future precipitation for your region, it's actually not really that helpful if you're a farmer or someone thinking about whether this is what your future looks like. So some of the research that my colleagues and I are interested in is thinking about how we make decisions despite this uncertainty, because although we have good projections, there's always going to be uncertainty about where, when, how much these climate changes will occur. So what we need to think about is how we can plan for surprises, or how we can actually be flexible so that we can change course if things don't turn out to be quite how we planned. So one approach might be to, instead of kind of optimising for a particular climate, which is I guess how we've operated a lot in the past, is accepting that you might have lower returns in some years, but you're sort of more robust across for a, I'm not explaining this very well, but you're trading off that kind of optimality for being robust across a range of future climates. And so that might be about being like incorporating diversity into your system. So you're not putting everything on one particular crop, or it might be about locations, like having different locations around the region or the country. And in some ways, New Zealand's quite lucky in that it's quite long and thin. So as the climate becomes less suitable in the north, we can shift gradually down south, perhaps. So it gives us some room to move at least. We also need to consider the lead time. So if we are thinking we need to change our systems or make some big structural changes into the future, what do we need to do now so that we're able to do it when the climate actually changes? So we might not need to do it now. We might be fine in our current system, but we know that in future we might need to change. So what do we need to do to set it up so that we can when the time comes? And I guess just also emphasising that if we also think about the short term, if we always think about the short term, it can lead us into making decisions that in the long term we call maladaptive. So they're actually going to make us more vulnerable in the future. And that's, I guess, across every aspect of human decision making, not only in the land use sector. Okay, and really just one final point is that the timing of action is really important. And so this is both for reducing emissions and adapting to the impacts. There was a study a couple of years ago now that looked at if New Zealand starts to reduce its emissions now, compared to if it delays action and then has to do things much more drastically just before 2050, the economic impacts would be much harsher and extreme if we delay action and do it abruptly than if we set things in place, do it carefully, try and take everyone on board. So the timing of action is very important. So just to summarise, I guess land is under increasing pressure. There is quite globally an urgent need to reduce emissions. And we also, but alongside that, we really need to plan for the impacts of climate change, despite this uncertainty. And I'll just finish with another cartoon because they're always fun, but it's a little blurry, but it's like You've probably seen it anyway. People have got t-shirts with it on, but what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So I'll leave you with that. And yeah, if you've got any questions or anything you'd like to discuss, please go for it.